A widespread challenge to 3 million Israelites has to do with the possibility of reaching those numbers in the time available. There are two different interpretations on how long the Israelites were living in Egypt. The Bible mentions 430 and 400 years. One view states that these 430 years were all in Egypt. The other view interprets the 430 years were the time in Canaan and Egypt before the Exodus. This is because they represent the time from the promises to Abraham to the Exodus. This would mean about half that time, or 215 years in Egypt. How would you reconcile that with even population growth? Because I know that when Joseph and his family went into Egypt, they were a lot. I mean, they were like 70, and if you multiply, people over the course of time, they would.
Yeah, I did all that work. I did all the maths. I had a maths friend to help me. 70 men turning into a total population of 6,000 people over 4 generations is a high birth rate. If you count up how many sons there were per father in the patriarchal period, and then you count up how many sons there were per father in the sojourn period and the Exodus coming out of Egypt, you find that each father had around about between 3 and 4 sons, which means they had between 7 and 8 children per father. And if you do the math, start off with 70 men, and you do the math through 4 generations, you come out to around about 6,000 people in all. So you have to double it out for women. And that's a high birth rate.
The account of God's promises to Abraham mentions 400 years of oppression for Abraham's descendants. It also mentions that they would come out of Egypt in the 4th generation on their way to inheriting the promised land. If it was just 4 generations in Egypt, that would severely limit the amount of population growth.
It's 430 years from the day that God spoke to Abraham and said, you're going to have a child, Isaac, and he and his great-grandchildren are going to be enslaved by a foreign people. 430 years from that day, the Jews left Egypt. They were in Egypt 210 years. So from the time that God spoke to Abraham, Isaac is born. Once Isaac is born, the 400 years begins.
The view of 400 years of slavery does not fit the biblical information.
You notice that in Exodus chapter 1, when we start the chapter, the Israelites are free people, and they're still living in Goshen.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's probably 125 years after Joseph and his family went there. Remember, they only went there to avert a 7-year famine. And why should they still be living there 125 years later? Because of bounty. It was magnificent what they could have versus what they had in the land of Canaan.
The Bible has Joseph living for another 71 years after his family moved to Egypt. And it says that only after Joseph's generation died out were they enslaved. So if they were in Egypt exactly 430 years, the time of slavery had to be less than 360 years, with perhaps a century beforehand living freely in the land.
So Israel was given, well, the book of Genesis says it was the best of the land, the fat of the land. They could go there and live. They went there and they were bequeathed this magnificent territory called in the Bible the land of Goshen, known today as the Wadi Tumilat, because the Pharaoh had experienced such good luck, if I may use that expression. But this new king arises and he decides he's not going to recognize the Goshen land grant. Okay. He says, the Pharaoh is saying to his people, come, let us deal shrewdly with them, the Israelites, because if war befall us, they will join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. In other words, it is logical for a native Egyptian Pharaoh to imagine that these Hebrews who come from Canaan are more likely to become allies of his enemy, the Hyksos.
Yeah.
And so in order to avoid that, he takes a preemptive action. He makes a preemptive strike, and they are enslaved at that moment.
Abraham was the first of the fathers to take a step into Egypt. And then we have Joseph entering in, certainly under his rulership. He's second leader in the land, and Israel is flourishing in the land. But what we're told at the beginning of Exodus is a new Pharaoh rises who did not know Joseph. And it's in that moment that God is also multiplying the people to such an extent. Israel is becoming so vast and so great. This is not a small people. Israel is becoming so vast that Pharaoh and his Egyptian armies themselves are nervous about how big Israel has become. Years later, the same thing will be said of Israel in relation to Moab. I think it's Numbers 23, where the king of Moab is fearful because it says the people of Israel were many. So yes, there was a season where they were in Egypt, not enjoying all the blessings and therefore afflicted, challenged, and yet still flourishing. And then there's a season in which they are oppressed under the hand of this serpent-like king, Pharaoh.
So Moses is born, and his life is in danger because all male children are being killed by Pharaoh. And so to save him, or to put him in God's hands, his mother puts him in a basket and sends him down, floating down the Nile. His sister stands there watching, his sister Miriam, to see what the fate of this child is going to be. Pharaoh's daughter comes down, finds the child, falls in love with the child, takes him home, and raises him.
So from your research, what did you learn about the Israelites in Egypt?
Well, what I learned first was that the most important word in the Old Testament is the word but.
But?
But, or and, which has the same meaning. Because the word and, which is one of the major grammatical words for Hebrew structure of prose and poetry, always tells you there's a story that went on before, and this is a continuation. But it also says this story now is what God does in contrast to all that has been going on before. So the but of God is one of the most important theological concepts of the Old Testament. And
do you have an example of that?
Well, I have plenty of examples of that. In the instance of the Israelites, they were persecuted, killed, put to hard slave labor. The but of God was multiplication. God said, but they multiplied. And they multiplied, and they multiplied.
So they were being persecuted, they were dying, but
they multiplied.
The fact that the Israelites were to come out in the fourth generation also does not fit 400 years in Egypt. These are some of the factors favoring the idea that 400 years pertain to the time in Canaan and Egypt, with just over 2 centuries in Egypt. Moses wrote that when Jacob's family came into Egypt, it already included nearly 70 males. In the list of 70 names from Genesis 46, only 2 females are included, 1 daughter and 1 granddaughter. The other wives and daughters were not included. But if they were only in Egypt for 210 or 215 years, was it possible for them to grow to 3 million, especially if it happened over just 4 generations?
When you go through the generations, the 70 people that entered Egypt and only allowing 4 generations, which both the biblical chronology as well as Josephus support being 215 years in Egypt. When Israel comes out of Egypt after 215 years, in the 4th generation, it doesn't allow for a very large population.
So you're suggesting there's about 8,000 people that left.
Yes.
And that's because of the 70 that went in. Those are 70 men, right? They talked about there were 70 men, but they had their wives and their children. So it might have been more than 70 in the beginning.
But even with wives, and it would also have included his grandchildren in that, because at that point in time you had Zerah and Perez.
Yes, the 70 that came into Egypt when Joseph's family came to the area, then grew into a multitude, right? And the Egyptians were worried that if there was war...
Joseph's family, it was the rest of Canaan that had immigrated to Egypt. So there was a vast population. Based on the 70 persons that immigrated to Egypt, 70 people out of Jacob's loins. So if you take those 70 people, including grandchildren, it does not allow for a large population to be produced among the seed of Jacob within 4 generations.
Imagine if on average every father had 7 children. That means some had a lot more, and some had 5 or 3. You know, so that's very realistic. If you look at the other numbers, though, you have fathers having 20 children.
Some believe the solution to this challenge may lie in the fact that the only record in the Bible of fulfillment of the 4th generation promise was Moses' family. The line of Levi to Moses covered the time in Egypt in just 4 generations, as seen in Exodus chapter 6. However, they lived to great ages, and Moses himself was 80 years old at the point of Exodus. Apparently, most of the other Israelites were fulfilling the multiplication promise, which required marrying young and having many children. This also fits historical records that show people often married at much younger ages in ancient times. The Bible records that Benjamin already had 10 sons when he entered Egypt. And other genealogies record many more than 4 generations for Israelites in this period. The approach seen here takes 23 years as a midpoint for an average childbearing generation. This would allow 9 generations in 210 years. If we take 70 potential family units at the start of the sojourn in Egypt, an average of just 3 sons per family, the 9th generation would reach nearly 1.4 million males, with many from previous generations still living at that point. So it can be seen that 210 years is enough time to go from 70 males to over 1.5 million males, including 600,000 adult men. With females added, it would mean over 3 million. This appears to fit the straightforward reading of the numbers in the text well, if Aleph is taken as 1,000. The idea of 3 boys, or 6 children total for an average family, does not seem very high from the biblical report that they were multiplying exceedingly. Those who favor high numbers for the population believe that both a high growth rate and a large population is required by the biblical account, and a growth rate much less than this would contradict that description. This is yet another reason favoring about 210 years in Egypt, since 430 years in Egypt at this same rate would produce over 27 billion males in the 18th generation. The Bible gives an indication that there were literally 600,000 men.
Yes.
Do you think that that's even possible?
From the point of view of the numbers given, they have been given so carefully. They have been repeated. You could draw a statistic on it, on the birth rate. You could see how they multiplied, how they were diminished. You could actually follow the whole track of it. So I had no problem, because if there is no space problem, there's no numerical problem. For me, running a place like this and having come from business, it was more of a managerial problem. And then I found that this was manageable by a system of management which is absolutely perfect. It's ingenious.
So the question really has been, so many are saying that it's just not even possible that as many people as the Bible suggests could have gone off into the wilderness.
Well, who is allowed to pass verdict on this? Just by thinking it's impossible. We manage bigger crowds today, and we have had armies of hundreds of thousands on the march. So only when it comes to the Bible and to the people of Israel, we express our doubts and says this cannot have been. Why not? The book of Exodus is a very detailed record, sometimes accidentally mentioning things that you don't think up. You certainly can't think it up centuries later. It must have been temporal. It must have been actual, just on the spot.
But right in here,
Steve Rudd also doesn't have a problem with the larger population.
this is like 18, 20 kilometers wide.
Yeah, it'd be a big campsite.
It's big. And you know, there's 3.5 million Hebrews that are making this migration. Now remember, people that have an issue with that number, we've had several cases in the United States where at Washington, D.C., they've had 1 million, 500,000, 1.5 million people in an area that's like half a square mile, 3/4 of a square mile. So large populations can squash into a small geographic area. This is much, much, much larger than that.
Yeah, in fact, we actually looked at gatherings around the world.
Yes.
And looking at the same thing, between 1 million to 3-4 million people compressed into an area. It's amazing how many people can get into a small area.
When the Rolling Stones came to Canada, I mean, they had like 800,000 people, and it was in a farmer's field. So absolutely, large numbers of people can be compressed into a small area, and this area here is quite large.
This is a photo of a 1994 Rod Stewart concert in Brazil with an audience of 3.5 million people. And this is the Kumbh Mela, a month-long Hindu religious festival at India's Ganges River. It's the largest known human gathering in history, with estimates up to 30 to 50 million people attending on a single day. If the Israelite population had grown in line with a straightforward reading of the numbers, many believe it would have been just what God had promised Abraham.
If the people of Israel were in the range of 1.5 to 2 million, is that really realistic? Well, we know how many they were when they came to the area, and we know roughly the number of years they spent in Egypt. And if we look at that and look at the growth rate per year, we end up with 3.5 to 4%. And that is what we have today in the Arab nations around Sahara and what we have had in South America. And we know from the biblical text that there was an enormous growth of people, and that's the reason why the Egyptians became scared of the Hebrews. So probably the birth rate and the population growth is correct.
If there were this many Israelites, then what does that mean when we look at the population numbers during the time of the conquest?